Bienvenido a Café Espacial. Conduce el Dr. Fermín Romero Vázquez. Análisis con líderes expertos e influencers del futuro de la Agencia Espacial Global. Exploración espacial y potencial, extensión de la raza humana en el universo. Ámbitos más prometedores del sector espacial y sus protagonistas en gobierno, industria y servicio, academia y ONGs. Beneficios de la ciencia y tecnología espacial para toda la sociedad. Desde tierra firme, es momento de un café. Café Espacial.
Okay, my friends, we are ready again with our special guest, Dr. Stephen Freeland from Australia. For this second, we are going to talk about the urgent need of... Hello, my friends, this is Fermín Romero, and once again in Café Espacial. This time we... Hello, my friends, this is Fermín Romero, and once again in Café Espacial. This time we have an excellent friend. He is Dr. Stephen Freeland. He's an Emeritus Professor at Western Sydney University. He's also Professional Fellow at Bond University and Director of the International Institute of Space Law. He also holds visiting and adjunct position at various other universities, institutes in Copenhagen, in Vienna, in Toulouse, in Hong Kong, Montreal, Kuala Lumpur, Vancouver, and London. Prior to becoming an academic, he had a 20 years career in an international commercial lawyer and an investment banker. He's a member of the Australian Space Agency Advisory Board and has been an advisor of the Australian, New Zealand, Norwegian, and several other governments on issues related to the national space legislative frameworks and policy. He has represented the Australian government at the United Nations Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, in addition to co-editing the annotated leading cases of international criminal tribunals book series. He also sits on the editorial advisory board of a number of internationally recognized academic journals. Dear friend, I seriously appreciate your company because the time difference between Mexico and Australia is around 15 hours. So it is a pleasure for me to have you here with us in Café Espacial.
Oh, thank you, Fermin. It's my pleasure to be here. I've only visited your country a couple of times and I've loved it, and the people are so lovely. So to be able to talk to you and talk to people watching, it's my pleasure. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We met, do you remember we met in Hawaii, right?
That's right, a long time ago, that's right.
Long time ago.
What a terrible place,
yeah.
What a terrible place.
Exactly, my friend. Well, this first vlog, we are going to talk about the role of UN COPUOS and the need to update the space law in the face of the new realities that offer the current technological developments and the new space. As you may know, well, you know, but no, scientific and technological development had existed the elementary but fundamental space law codified within the United Nations. The new realities and the projections into the near long-term future oblige us to complement these foundations created between late 1960s and subsequent decades. Do you think that COPUOS is prepared to face this great challenge? What countries or regions could you propose, could propose an initiative on this regard, my friend? What do you think?
Oh, it's a great question, and before I start, let me also say, as I always do, and this is of course relevant for your country, that where I sit in Australia is land that has been occupied, well, occupied is the wrong word, inhabited by our Indigenous people for 65,000 years.
Yeah.
And the Australian Indigenous people are sometimes regarded as the world's first astronomers, and they have incredible knowledge about space. And you mentioned that I was on the advisory board of the Australian Space Agency. The emblem of the Australian Space Agency is our country from an Indigenous space perspective. And so I really want to acknowledge where I'm sitting. We have so much to learn from all of the knowledge and experience and stewardship and custodianship that our Indigenous people have about space. And I know it's the same in your country. And,
so we're very similar in that regard.
It's very important. So COPUOS, well, as you mentioned, there is a United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. It was established already immediately after Sputnik went up in 1957. So in 1958, we had an ad hoc committee, and then it became permanent in 1959. Australia, my country, was a foundation member of COPUOS and has had a strong voice.
As Mexico too.
And Mexico, I was about to say, and Mexico. Mexico, I mean, I had the pleasure of going there. Mexico is always putting forward its views. It has a strong voice. It's an important voice in space. And so I applaud you and your country for expressing important points of view. So the challenge about COPUOS. So one of the mandates that COPUOS has under its establishment through the United Nations is to examine legal issues, particularly in light of the changing nature of opportunities and activities in space. And as you mentioned, Fermin, everybody knows technology is just racing ahead, far, far quicker than law can ever keep up. We understand that. That's not unique to space. We see that in other areas of activity as well, you know, cloning and bioethics, and in even the warfare and the technology. So, but also in space, technology races ahead, and it's important to try to fix frameworks that help us move forward in a way that will maintain the stability, the security, and the sustainability of space. So that's an important role. It's a difficult role. But I have to say, even though COPUOS is an intergovernmental process, and a lot of people criticize it because it takes a long time to have decisions, when you look at what COPUOS has created during its existence, so you mentioned the treaties, and these treaties, even though you're right, you know, they're the 60s and the 70s, but they have fundamental principles that have meant that by and large space has worked in the 70 years or so since we've been going to space. Those principles have served us really well. They continue to serve us well, and they will be so relevant in the future. So even though the law does not keep up on the specifics, the fundamental principles apply and will apply, and every new activity has to fall within those principles. And again, that's not unique to space. If you think of the laws of war, right? They have the Geneva Conventions, 1949, you know, that's even older. And yet, even though the technology of warfare has completely changed, those fundamental principles are still so important in the way you conduct warfare. So space law is important. That said, we're doing things now that weren't even in the contemplation of the drafters of the treaties 60 years ago. We couldn't even imagine some of the things we're doing even 10 years ago. And we don't know what will happen in the next 10 years. You know, the technology moves ahead. And so it's important to find codes of conduct, standards, instruments, guidelines, frameworks that will help us move forward in an appropriate way. And I think, notwithstanding that COPUOS is intergovernmental and these things take time, and you know, it's a consensus-based organization which has its issues, but I think that's a positive. I think COPUOS is in a good position if you look at what it's looking at some of the major challenges around debris. It's looking at challenges around small sat constellations and space traffic management and remote sensing and GNSS. All of those issues are being discussed. You have roughly 100 countries and observers in the room. The main spacefaring nations, virtually every spacefaring nation is in that room. They are discussing, they are reaching consensus. Everybody has a buy-in so that even though it takes time, whatever outcomes you get, everybody has had the opportunity to contribute. And therefore, that's important because it's about processes as much as it is about substance. If you just had 3 or 4 or 5 countries saying these are the standards that everybody else must comply with, you're not going to get approval or buy-in from everybody. The way COPUOS works is, even though there are lots of debates, in the end, the outcomes they achieve are achieved by consensus. Everybody has had a buy-in. And so we are moving forward. They're now, as you know, and we'll talk about it, now looking at other new issues like resource exploitation, perhaps. And so on the issues that technology allows us to look at and to engage in, COPUOS is becoming active, but we need, in addition to that, to make sure that civil society and communities and countries on a unilateral and bilateral and minilateral basis all contribute and give inputs to this multilateral COPUOS process to ensure that the outcomes we have are the outcomes that are the most appropriate, because we've got to get it right. There's no point in having a solution which cements in a way of practice that actually is unsustainable. We need to get it right. We need to get inputs from various layers that come up to the multilateral process. But it's difficult. You and I, Famin, we will have a job for life talking about all of this because the technology allows for new and new things. But I think COPUOS is in a good position. Where else in the world at the moment, for example, would you get consensus on big important issues? This is a strange geopolitical time. We can't even get the world to work together very well on addressing this horrible COVID situation or addressing climate change, right? We can't get the world to work on that, yet we're able to achieve consensus on relatively big issues like, let's move forward in an appropriate way on resources or space traffic management. We're able to get consensus at COPUOS, and it's a unique forum in that regard. It's a large forum, and yet in the end, after tough bargaining, no doubt, and tough discussions, we find a way forward because we have to find a way forward. It's in everybody's interest. So, I'm a bit of an optimist. I think COPUOS is working reasonably well. It's the most important fora to get the solutions, but input must come from all different sides, all different communities, so that when they put those solutions together, as I said, they've thought about all of the appropriate issues to have the best possible solution to allow, as I say, for the safety, stability, and sustainability of space. I hope you agree with me that
of course I agree. In fact, the current space governance systems, from the best practice and self-regulation developed by spacecraft and satellite operators and relevant industry associations, to the 4 core treaties of the United Nations, and the consensus guidelines, and finally the national policy and regulatory governance, aren't enough to regulate the current human space activities. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think as I said, every activity that we are thinking about doing must fall within the principles around cooperation, around peaceful uses, around due regard. So yes, I think the foundations are there to govern all of these activities. Because of the increasing involvement of non-governmental entities who are investing real money, of course, to the extent we can provide more detailed specifics about what is required and what is necessary, that is better, because it will help them make the appropriate decisions in terms of the development of the technology. But I think we already have the foundations there. And as I said, you know, if you look at what we've done over the last 70 years based on foundational principles that were agreed in a totally different era, and yet they still work. You know, I think, notwithstanding all of the challenges, and indeed there are challenges, we, you know, have a positive future with space, as long as we all recognize that we have to engage in responsible behavior. You can have all of the rules in the world. If people want to act badly, you know, they will act badly, and that would have irreversible negative consequences for all of us. So, of course, all the rules, the standards, the understandings, the common elements are there, but they all must be directed towards responsible behavior in space.
Completely agree, my friend. United States has stated that the Outer Space Treaty does not provide a comprehensive international regime for space resources and utilizations activity. At this stage, the United States sees neither or need nor a practical basis to create such a regime. We are right now in the midst of a crisis of multilateralism that affects practically all the specialized international organizations. What opinion do you envision for an eventual relaunch of space law?
Well, I perhaps disagree with you a little bit about what you said about.
Go ahead, please. Please.
I'm in a very honored position of working with all of these governments in the work that I do around the UN and COPUOS, particularly on resources, but on other things. And I deal with all of, you know, I have the honor of dealing with all of the countries, including the United States, but all of the others as well. I actually think the United States has reiterated the centrality of the Outer Space Treaty on a few occasions. In fact, I wrote a paper with a dear friend of mine, Ram Jaku, about 6 or 7 years ago, at a time when some in the United States were saying that they should withdraw from the Outer Space Treaty. Now, thankfully, that wasn't a suggestion that was taken up. And since then, you've seen actually so many statements by the United States talking about the centrality of the Outer Space Treaty. And indeed, you mentioned about resources, and I know we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Even in the initiatives that the United States is leading, and we all know about the Artemis Accords, both within the Artemis Accords and in all of the statements around that by all of the Artemis Accord signatories, they all emphasize that everything is based on the Outer Space Treaty. So I think the Outer Space Treaty is regarded by not only the United States, by every country, as being as important, if not more important than it ever has been. That said, of course, as we discussed already, it doesn't talk about specifics. It's a foundational principles. It's a treaty of principle. And so there is room for different interpretations of the treaty.
Yes, of course.
No doubt. But that's, again, not unique to space law. You see that in every area of international law. That's the nature of treaties. They are left open to states to interpret them in good faith, of course. So I think the Outer Space Treaty will continue to help us move forward, but you're right. We need to ensure that clarity is there, that we're all moving in the right direction, that our interpretations of, let's say, Article 2 or Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty they don't have to be identical, because international law allows for differing interpretation, but they have to be with the same fundamentals in mind: of cooperation, of peace, of common interests, of looking after and custodianship of outer space, of sustainability moving forward. And I think the United States, like most of the other countries recognizes that, of course, it wants to maximize its own advantage, but it recognizes that if we engage in irresponsible behavior, if anyone does, that will affect all of us, including the big countries. And so I'm not as perhaps pessimistic about some of the things that are moving forward. I see good faith and goodwill in the room when you see the multilateral discussions, at least in those committees that I'm involved in, because I think even though people come from different perspectives with different viewpoints and different value systems, they all want to ensure that we don't do something to absolutely destroy our ability to garner the advantages and benefits of space moving forward. So I think that there's more in common amongst all of the countries than there are differences, notwithstanding, of course, that every country wants to maximize its own position. Again, I hope you are as optimistic as I am. I mean, you have to be optimistic.
Yeah. Okay, my friend. And regarding the space mining and space tourism in this new space era, do you consider that they require a multilateral regulation?
Oh, absolutely. I think they do.
Excellent.
So you mentioned tourism. Let's talk about that first. I mean, we've had space tourists already since the early 2000s. Very, very wealthy people. 8 or 9 of them, I think, went to the International Space Station, spending between 20 and 30 million US dollars. Okay, that's tourism for the absolute elite. That's unusual. Then, of course, last month, in July, we had both Sir Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos going up to the edges of space. Did they go to space? That's another debate, but they went quite a long way up in the air to show off the technologies from their own companies for the idea of suborbital tourism. So you've got orbital tourism, you've got suborbital tourism. People are projecting now that we will have a vibrant international tourism industry in the next few years with many thousands of people going to space. I'm not convinced it'll be that quick, but certainly we are looking to send more and more humans to space as tourists, as astronauts, on space stations like the International Space Station, and then maybe ultimately permanent settlements on, let's say, the moon. I can't even imagine Mars at this stage. And as we move humans more and more to space, we need to think carefully about the rules, the laws that will govern the activities of human beings, both to protect them, their rights to protect them, but also their obligations. For example, the astronauts on the International Space Station, they have rights, but they also have to sign a code of conduct in terms of their activity. When you move forward to space tourism, do they have rights of rescue? What's the situation? Or do they waive all of their rights through the contract they sign before they fly? We've seen in the air law domain that we've had standards about what happens with liability. We don't have the same sort of regime for individuals in space, so we need to work about that. And perhaps the most interesting thing about humans in space is, let's say, your children's children, Fermin, are going to be living on the moon in a settlement. What rights do they have? What laws will apply to them? What laws will apply as they interact with each other? How will they be protected? Do they have a right to return? What happens if they want to get married? What happens if they have a child? What happens if they kill each other?
Many issues, many exciting issues.
Yeah, we will need to develop those laws.
The extension of the humanity to the space.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. My mind cannot envisage hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in space.
Yeah.
I can't think like that, but who knows what will happen in the centuries to come. But as we expand with humans, because that's what we would like to do, we will need to ensure what standards of behavior apply to them. And living permanent, your great grandchildren living on the moon will need to understand that they're in a unique and dangerous environment. If you do the wrong thing, that has consequences. There'll need to be laws, and we can't just say, well, let's take the law that apply to you and I here living on Earth and just apply that on the moon. It's a totally different environment. So we'll need to create laws as respect to those humans as well. So there's many exciting things.
Excellent.
On the resources thing, and obviously resources is related to that, because if we are going to have permanent human settlements, let's say on the moon.
Yeah, let's keep that issue for another block. We will move very quickly to a short break.
Okay.
And then we will continue talking about this. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Fermin.
Okay. Okay, my friends, we are ready again with our special guest, Dr. Stephen Freeland from Australia. For this second, we are going to talk about the urgent need of governance models for human activities in outer space. And I would like to ask you, which role plays the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities in the new governance models, my dear friend?
Wow, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a genius. We need the long-term sustainability guidelines that, as you know, were finally agreed after a long discussion of many years. Finally agreed in 2019, although the discussions are still going on. Really marked a turning point, because they really highlighted the need for us to understand the fragility of space.
Yes.
The fact that it's another area that if we continue to make the same mistakes we've made on Earth, then that will have permanent consequences for us. It means that we will not be able to access and navigate space in the same way as we have at the moment, and therefore not be able to get the benefits. That's even more important because we want to send more and more humans to space. And clearly, if space becomes more and more filled with debris, and we know the hazards and dangers of debris, that makes it more and more dangerous for human beings. And we obviously have a responsibility to those human beings. So the long-term sustainability guidelines gives us some practices. They're at a high level, but they have galvanized the way we think about space even more. That we can't assume a business as usual case. We can't continue to interact with space in exactly the same way that we have in the past, because there are now literally hundreds of millions of pieces of debris, and that's growing at an exponential rate. And of course, we want to send up many more pieces of space objects into space. So if you think from the time of Sputnik to today, humanity has probably sent up, let's say, about 9,000-10,000 objects into space. If the well-known and well-publicized plans of just a few companies, and we all know who the companies are, come into fruition, in the next 10 years, we'll send up 100,000. So 10 times what we've sent up in 70 years, we'll send in the next 10 years. So space is becoming much more crowded. and in popular orbits. And even though they may not be the orbits where humans might stay, anything carrying humans has to go through these orbits. So navigating space is difficult. So the long-term sustainability guidelines, in the end, we will need to continue to work on it. And as you know, the working group now has a new bureau and is continuing its work to find additional ways to ensure that we continue to use space, but we don't make space an unsustainable, unnavigable. We continue to allow space to work in terms of sending more humans to space. We create, let's say, channels where we have launch paths, and because we're using reusable vehicles with humans now, we have channels where we have, you know, cleaner skies so that it's safer for humans. There's a whole lot of issues. People say to me, well, let's fix the rules on resources, and let's fix the rules on human spaceflight, and let's fix the laws on space traffic management. Mm-hmm. The beauty of space, Fermin, and you know this, is everything is connected. If you want to fix the issues about human spaceflight, you need to also address sustainability. You need to also address space traffic management, etc. Yeah. Everything is connected, and that gets back to the point I made before the break, that in the end, we need to find the solutions based on a whole range of inputs to make sure that those solutions work. Because if we were just to try to fix this little problem over here, we might, without thinking about it, create more problems over here in this activity. And so sustainability, human spaceflight, completely interactive. I agree with you that we continually must think about ways of making space as safe as possible. It's never going to be as safe as flying on an airplane, going to space. Of course it's not. But if we are to generate interest, if we are to generate this industry, this tourism industry, and as I said, I think we're still a long way from a big industry, but we're moving in that direction. If we are to generate trust and the willingness of us to go to space in larger numbers, then we have to create a sustainable platform for space and a safe area for space. And so everything is related.
Yeah. And besides these guidelines, in your personal view, what kind of governance models for human activities in outer space do we need?
Well, that's a really tough one, because historically, governing the behavior of individuals has been down to countries based on territoriality and based on their national jurisdiction and national. In the origin, yeah. Of course, now, if getting back to a settlement on the moon, let's say, it would be unworkable to have 20 people in a settlement from 20 different countries and 20 different laws apply to them depending on which country you came from, right? That's the sort of system that we have on the International Space Station, where, as you know, in each module, because they're registered separately as different space objects, we have different laws. So Japanese law applies in the Japanese module, and Russian law applies in the Russian module, and US law. Now, that works for the space station because it's a one-off. It's an ad hoc solution, and the participating states all agreed that's the way it would be, because none of them wanted to give up, if you like, their jurisdiction. But if we're now talking about permanent settlements somewhere else, one, it's not territorial. So national law, as you know, by definition, does not apply in space. It might apply to people on objects through a registration process, but it doesn't apply in space. But secondly, if you've got different people interacting together in this unique environment, they have to be guided by the same rules and the same standards. You can't have different rules applying, because that would, one, give rise to conflict, and two, give rise to dangers. And so where will that governance model come from? Who will govern it? What rules will be made? They're questions, excellent questions. I'm sorry, I don't have the answers, but we are already we are already working, everybody understands the issues, and we need to create, and I suspect it'll come through the UN system, a code of conduct, if that's the right expression, for humans living in permanent settlements, but it'll need to be standardized so that everybody plays to the same standards. They can all look after each other. Everybody understands what the rights and obligations of everybody else are, just like on Earth. In Mexico, you know, you all play by the same standards. You all have Mexican law, and likewise in my country, in Australia. In those permanent settlements, it won't be national law, but it will still be a set of standards that are agreed, I presume, through the UN system and applied. What they will say, I don't know, because I don't understand enough about what will be required. But certainly those rules will be very different in some respects from the rules that you and I live with on Earth.
Okay, we will go to another short break, but in the third block, we are going to talk about the space resource discussion at the UN, in particular on the establishment of a working group on space resources in the UN COPUOS, okay? Okay, my friends, we're already come back with our friend, Stephen Freeland. He's a legal expert on space law. And for this third block, we're going to talk about the establishment of a working group on space resources in COPUOS. Plans for the extraction of water or minerals in outer space, particularly in the moon with the Artemis Accords, are developing faster than international law is evolving to address this reality. As a result, the legal subcommittee of the UN COPUOS held informal consultations during the recent 2021 annual session to consider the theme exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources. My dear friend, tell us a little bit more on these discussions and what are the things you envision on this regard.
Oh, thank you. So, yes, space resources is an issue that the idea of utilizing space resources is an issue that has captured the imagination of everybody. But it's not a new issue. We all know that in the 1970s already, there was great excitement based on the idea of perhaps mining the resources of the moon based on an examination of the moon rock that the Apollo missions had brought back. And we know out of those discussions, we got the Moon Agreement, one of the 5 UN treaties. The terms of the Moon Agreement were agreed by consensus, COPUOS. We all know that subsequently only 18 countries, including your country and my country, have ratified it. So we are brothers and sisters together on that as well, and on many things. You know, Australia and Mexico have a lovely relationship. And so it's not widely subscribed, although Mexico and Australia, as I said, are parties to it. But it covered the whole idea of exploiting resources. Then that issue, in a sense, fell away and other activities in space. But now, as technology has improved, as industry has become involved, as the money is being raised to develop technologies that might work, as countries like my country, which has a wonderful mining industry, particularly mining in remote areas, can say, hey, we've got the technology to extract in remote areas, maybe that could be used on the moon, as the United States and other countries, China and Russia, have ambitions to go to the moon, to land rovers, as some of those countries already have, to take samples and more. The notion of resources has become a real issue again now.
Yes.
And industry is pushing it. And industry has lobbied governments in certain countries to pass national laws. We know about the United States, we know about Luxembourg, we know about the United Arab Emirates, and most recently Japan, to, under at least national law, to say, well, this is an activity that national law might allow, subject to, and this is the big point, subject to international obligations, right? So that has generated more interest, particularly started from 2015 when the United States under the Obama administration passed its law. That generated a lot of discussion, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, at least initially in COPUOS. But the issue of the exploration, exploitation, utilization of resources came onto the agenda, has been on the agenda since then. And more we're seeing from the initial stance where some countries said, this is something we cannot and must not do. You see now over the succeeding 4 or 5 or 6 years, we've moved to a point where we don't have countries saying that anymore. We have the feeling is, if this is something we're going to do, let's do it in the right way. And so there's a general, I think, sentiment that this is an activity that is probably likely to happen. I don't know when. Again, industry says it'll happen very soon. You know, I'm a bit more conservative in my feeling, but that doesn't matter. It's an activity that might ultimately happen. And therefore, because it's such a large issue, it completely redefines the way we look at space. And how we interact with space. What is space for us? What is our place in space? But also because some are attracted by the lure of so much money and wealth and the creation of large economies, we need to be very careful about the way we move forward. And one more point on that is, of course, if you look on Earth, many wars, many conflicts have been started by ambitions of colonizing for resources. And so clearly we need to avoid that kind of thinking. The treaties, of course, don't allow for that. But if you start talking about resources in a really serious way, you have to ensure that people understand the limits of what they can do. So already in 2019, a couple of countries, Greece and Belgium, put to the COPUOS the proposition that we should have a working group. As you know, Fermin, but perhaps some of your listeners don't. When COPUOS, the legal subcommittee or the scientific technical subcommittee, or indeed the plenary, decide an issue is really worth examining and we need some outcomes,
the plenary session.
They establish a working group. And so already in 2019, a couple of countries proposed the establishment of a working group for various reasons, mainly political. It was not accepted, but a halfway house, a compromise was reached to establish, and this had only happened once previously in COPUOS in the 1990s, scheduled informal consultations. So the countries would get together, but not as a working group, but as something on a lower level to discuss this issue. I was honored, along with Andrzej Misztal from Poland, to be appointed to moderate those discussions. They were supposed to happen in 2020 for COVID reasons. Of course, they couldn't. As you said, in 2021, we had 8 sessions of consultations during the legal subcommittee. They were difficult. For me, they were at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I was.
I know the
But I tried my best, and I, as I said, I had the honor of co-moderating. Ultimately, and we clearly had done a lot of work before that. There was, as I said previously, a lot of goodwill and good faith. And ultimately, the legal subcommittee has now agreed to set up a working group, a 5-year working group. Again, I've been honored to be appointed, along with, again, Dr. Michał from Poland. We are the co-chairs, and so it's a 5-year working group. There's a lot of work to be done, but it is now a path forward. What do we expect from that? Well, we're still working out the mandates, and there'll be some discussions in the COPUOS plenary very soon, where we hope to finalize that. But ultimately, as a first step, we need to understand what we're talking about. And so we will need to gather information from various experts to understand. As I said, one has to look at it holistically. You can't say, let's just fix this problem if we don't understand how it interacts with other types of issues. And so we'll need to understand what we're talking about, and then look at the existing legal frameworks, see how that applies or doesn't apply to these activities, and then take it from there. It's up to the member states, of course, what outcomes they would like to formally include in our mandate, which, as I said, will hopefully be approved very soon. But I'm, again, optimistic, because in the end, everybody wants us to move forward in an appropriate way. Everybody understands that if we get this wrong, this has the real possibility of causing problems, conflict, environmental disasters, debris. And so we have to get it right. And even those countries who, have tensions between themselves on Earth in this strange geopolitical times we are at, they are all in agreement that we need to move forward in a structured, appropriate way. And so I'm very hopeful, having seen the sentiments, having seen I think the genuineness of the countries in wanting to find answers to a way forward. I'm very confident that over time we'll get there, but it will take some time. In the meantime, we need to learn. We need to understand each other's
This
viewpoints.
process is starting,
but you need to have the proper process started in the proper way, with the proper people and the proper principles. And I think all of that is in place. So, I still think we have time. Notwithstanding that industry is saying they can do this tomorrow, I think we all understand we're nowhere near anything in terms of large-scale extraction possibilities yet. And so the timing is right. As we work, industry will develop, but in the end, the process will be driven by a consensus-led multilateral process, listening to voices from all levels of society. And so
I'm sorry, but let me ask you a difficult question in that regard. How can the interests of space resources collecting states be balanced with the interests of the spacefaring nations, including the interests of groups such as you mentioned at the beginning, the indigenous people in Australia, for example?
Again, that's the right question to ask, and it is a balance, as you know. But I think the starting point for that is space we are all stakeholders in space. Every human on Earth is a stakeholder in space because of the legal characterization of space, but also in practical terms, we're all dependent on space. Whether or not you are a large spacefaring country or a smaller, less industrialized country, you need access to space technologies. And of course, there's a big space divide between the haves and the have-nots. And that's a major issue. Like we've had a digital divide in the internet, we have a space divide, and we need to try to generate more equitable distribution of capabilities and access. Okay. That's one of the issues we need to take into account. We need to take into account the needs of developing countries, which is a strong theme in space. We need to understand of course, that some countries will be expending lots of capital, lots of risk, lots of time, lots of energy, and we need to understand that. But in the end, space benefits everybody. And so whatever system moves forward needs to be in my, now I speak in my personal capacity, obviously not as the co-chair. In the end, it's up to member states. But as a human being, from one human being to another human being, we have to ensure that the benefits of space are enjoyed as broadly as possible by humanity. And when you look upon it, of course, nothing is equal, nothing is always equitable, but everybody has benefited from space. Even the poorest countries have benefited from space, you know, in terms of their ability to have communications networks, in terms of remote sensing activities which help them with agricultural management. Nothing is equal and things could be much better, but space gives benefits to everybody. And we have to ensure, I believe, as a human being, that if we are to engage in any activity of such a scale as what is being suggested with resources, that everybody benefits in a certain way. It won't be equal. It won't always look like it's fair. But in the end, we've worked it out in the past. We've worked it out with the geostationary orbit. Again, it's not entirely fair. It's not always equitable, but we have a process there that at least guarantees equitable access to everybody. That was a major issue about exploiting a resource. In that case, the resource was the orbit. If we can come up with a system, whatever the system is, for that sort of resource, I'm hopeful that we can come up with whatever the states members want in terms of the way we manage whatever activities about, if you like, the hard resources. But your question is absolutely the right question to ask. And we must keep that in the back of our mind, or even in the front of our mind, in all of these discussions.
Let me remark that it is better to hear you as an expert and not as a political. So that's very important for the audience that hear you explaining this important issue. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, yes, but I don't want, because I have this role and I'm neutral. I really want to help states get together. I don't want my views to be imposed on anybody. But we're all human beings. We all and thank you for your kind words. I think it's important that we understand that space is for everybody. Exactly. It will, and so I always have three overarching themes about anything to do with space. So just on that, the first is, as I mentioned, that we all have common interests in space. Exactly. We have much more in common than we have differences. So it's in our common interests, large country, small country, developed country, less developed country. It's in our common interests to ensure that that space remains sustainable. Secondly, space is all about humanity. It's all about humanity. Our rights are inextricably tied to the space. Our human rights, our lives, our livelihood, our development, the way we live, the fact that we live is all tied to space. So as we develop whatever processes in whatever activities, we must retain that humanity in space. And my third principle, so you've got common interests, you've got humanity. My third principle is one of stewardship, custodianship. We are custodians of the Earth, and we're not doing a great job. We're also custodians of the planets and of space. And we must take that responsibility carefully to ensure that not only our generation, but every generation. Space is a wondrous thing. It's a wonderful thing. In the end, space is multifaceted. it's not just political, and it's not just economic, and it's not just military because it's used for military activity.
Yeah.
It's cultural as well. It's scientific. It's exploratory. It has religious overtones. It's all about civil society. It's about indigenous perspectives. It's about so many perspectives. And so whatever we do, we need to think carefully and move forward and listen to all of the voices in space, not just the loudest voice in the room, although, you know, loud voices are important, but so are the softer voices as well. Whatever we do as we move forward in our endeavors in space and in, you know, the areas that you and I are interested, particularly the policies and the governance and the laws and the framework, as we move forward, we have to ensure that we take into account all of those perspectives so that any solution is one that has thought about all of the issues. You won't be able to make everybody happy with every solution, of course, but you've got to ensure that you've heard all of the voices to make sure that the solutions we come up work to the greatest degree possible, because space is difficult, it's complex, but it's also wonderful. And we must continue to remember it's wonderful and not just a place that we take from. Because in the end, you know, space defines us, our relationship with space defines us, and it's about humans on Earth as much as it is adventures in space. So with those words, I hope, I wish everybody in Mexico well. I know you've had a tough time, as are we now with COVID and other things, but it's wonderful to talk to you, and I wish you well.
Latin America, some parts of the United States. Spain, we want to say thanks to our distinguished friend, Stephen Freeland. He's in a very different hour right now in Australia. So thank you so much, my friend. And I send you a big hug from Mexico. And let's keep in touch and have a nice weekend, okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you.